She was 27 and newly alone in the world, a stranger in a territory that had taken more than it gave. With her last $74, a sum earned from the forced sale of her father's tools, she was laughed out of the auction room for buying a heap of rock that was once the San Isidro bell tower. They said it was worthless, a tombstone on land the railroad already claimed as its own, but buried in the rubble was a secret kept for 100 years, a truth cast in bronze and written on paper, a secret that would change everything for the valley and for her. Sarah Whitaker's life had been shaped by the grain of wood and the quiet integrity of a well-made thing. She was born in a small Ohio town in 1853, the only child of Thomas and Eleanor Whitaker. Her mother was a woman of gentle hands and a garden full of herbs, but her lungs were fragile, and she passed into memory when Sarah was only 6. It was her father, Thomas, who raised her. He was a carpenter and cabinet maker, a man whose words were few, but whose hands spoke a language of precision and care. He did not believe a daughter was a creature for parlors and embroidery alone. He believed a human being should know how to make and how to mend. So while other girls learned stitches, Sarah learned the names of trees by the feel of their bark and the scent of their cutwood. She learned the difference between a mortise and a tenon, the satisfying curl of a shaving from a sharp plane, and the quiet dignity of a perfectly flush joint. Her father taught her that there was no shame in labor, only in a job poorly done. He taught her to see the character in a piece of timber, to respect its strengths and account for its weaknesses, and to build things that would outlast the builder. For her 10th birthday, he had given her not a doll, but a small bird he had whittled from a block of cedar. Its form so simple and smooth, it felt warm and alive in her palm. It was her most precious possession, a tangible piece of his steady, unconditional love. They came west to Colorado 5 years later, chasing the promise of dry mountain air for Thomas's own weakening lungs. The same affliction that had taken his wife had settled in his chest, a persistent, dusty cough that the damp Ohio winters made worse. He found work with the Denver and Rio Grande Western Railroad, his skills as a carpenter valuable in the construction of trestle bridges, water towers, and station houses that stitched the territory together. But the high, thin air and the constant dust from blasting and grating did not heal him. Instead, the work slowly wore him down. He grew thinner, his quietness deepening into a weary silence. Sarah, now a young woman, took on work herself, mending clothes for the railroad men and their families, her small earnings helping to supplement her father's wages. They lived in a small, company-owned house in Durango Junction, a town that existed only for the railroad. Last winter, the cough had finally taken him. He died in his sleep, his hand resting on the small table beside his bed where Sarah had placed a glass of water. He left her with his worn set of tools, a small life insurance policy that amounted to just over $100, and a profound and hollow loneliness. The railroad camp's foreman, a man named Barlow with a smile that never reached his eyes, had offered his condolences and then, a week later, his patronage. Sarah understood his meaning and refused him plainly and quietly. His kindness curdled overnight. The world, she was learning, had little room for a woman alone who would not bend. The ejection was not a dramatic confrontation, but a quiet, administrative cruelty. It came in the form of a notice tacked to her door a month after her father's funeral. The letter, penned in a clerk's neat hand and signed by Mr. Barlow, informed her that the company house was needed for a new worker with a family and that she was to vacate the premises within the week. It was all perfectly legal, perfectly reasonable on the surface, but Sarah felt the cold intent behind it. She was being erased. The same afternoon, Barlow approached her with an offer to buy her father's tools. He named a price that was less than a quarter of their worth, calling it a favor to help her on her way. She looked at the chisels with their hand-turned handles, the heavy mallets, the saws he had sharpened himself, each one a memory of his hands and his lessons. Selling them felt like a betrayal, But the $100 from the insurance had been spent on the burial and a headstone, and she had nothing else. She needed money to simply exist. She agreed to the sale, her voice even, her face betraying nothing of the fury and grief that tightened in her chest. As the man's assistant loaded the heavy tool chest onto a wagon, Sarah slipped her hand into her pocket and closed her fingers around the small, whittled cedar bird. It was all of her father she had left. The transaction left her with $74. That very day, the San Juan County clerk was holding an auction of tax-delinquent and unclaimed properties on the courthouse steps. It was a place for speculators and ranchers to pick up cheap grazing land. Sarah went not with any hope, but because she did not know where else to go. She stood at the back of the small crowd, listening as parcels were sold for hundreds, sometimes thousands of dollars. Then the auctioneer announced Lot 14. The old San Isidro Mission ruin, he said with a smirk. 1.5 acres, including the collapsed bell tower. Unfit for habitation. Title subject to clearance. A man from the railroad, a subordinate of Barlow's, called out. The Dionredo will clear the land, but we won't pay for the privilege. Laughter rippled through the crowd. The auctioneer asked for an opening bid of $20. Silence, $10. More silence, punctuated by a few chuckles. $5 then for the deed? Sarah saw the railroad men looking at each other, confident they could get the land for nothing after it was declared abandoned. In that moment, a strange resolve settled over her. It was a pile of rubble, yes, but it was land. It was a place. It could be hers. $74, she said, her voice clear and steady in the sudden quiet. The auctioneer's eyebrows shot up. The crowd turned to stare at the young woman in the plain, dark dress. A murmur went through them, then open laughter. The railroad man shook his head in disbelief. The auctioneer, eager to be done with it, slammed his gavel down. Sold. To the young lady with more money than sense. He handed her a flimsy receipt. She folded it, placed it in her pocket, and walked away from the courthouse, the sound of their mockery following her down the street. She did not look back. She had a place to go now. Her journey began the next morning at dawn. She had spent her last few coins on a small sack of flour, a packet of salt, and a slab of bacon. These, along with her father's blanket and the small cedar bird, were rolled into a tight bundle she carried on her back. The San Isidro Valley was a 2-day walk from Durango Junction, a path that led up from the dusty, coal-stained basin of the railroad town and into the high country. The first day was a relentless climb through ponderosa pine and scrub oak, the road a mere wagon track cut into the side of the mountain. The air grew thinner and cleaner with every mile. The clatter and smoke of the junction faded behind her, replaced by the rush of wind through the pines and the cry of a distant hawk. She walked with a steady, unhurried pace, the rhythm of her footsteps a quiet meditation. Her body ached with a fatigue that was both physical and emotional, the deep weariness of loss and uncertainty. Yet with every step that took her further from the town that had cast her out, a strange lightness grew within her. She was utterly alone, a single, small figure in a vast and indifferent landscape, but she was not adrift. The receipt in her pocket was an anchor. She had a destination. That evening, she made a small camp beside a creek, building a fire with the practiced efficiency her father had taught her on their journey west. She cooked a piece of bacon and mixed a bit of flour with water to make a crude flatbread, baking it on a hot stone. The simple meal, eaten under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed to hang just beyond her reach, was the best she had tasted in months. It was a meal she had provided for herself, on land that owed nothing to any company or foreman. The next day, the trail crested a high pass, and the valley of San Isidro opened up below her. It was a long green bowl carved between two towering granite ridges, a river snaking like a silver ribbon along its floor. And there, on a low mesa overlooking the river, she saw it. A jagged pile of stone and timber, a dark wound on the otherwise pristine landscape, the ruin of her bell tower. From this distance, it looked even more hopeless, a monument to decay. But as she stood there, the wind whipping her hair across her face, she felt no despair. She felt a quiet, fierce sense of ownership. That broken heap of stone was hers. It was the first thing in the world that was truly and completely hers. She began her descent into the valley, her steps now filled with a sense of purpose that was heavier and more real than the bundle on her back. She was not running from something anymore. She was walking toward her work. When she finally stood before it, the ruin was more formidable than it had appeared from the pass. What was left of the San Isidro bell tower was a squat, square base of adobe and fieldstone that rose perhaps 20 feet from the ground. Above that, where 2 more stories of the tower had once reached for the Colorado sky, was a catastrophic mountain of rubble. Massive, splintered timbers, some as thick as a man's chest and charred black from an ancient fire, lay tangled with a chaotic spill of sandstone blocks. The upper walls had collapsed inward and outward, creating a treacherous scree slope of broken rock and crumbling mortar around the base. Hardy yellow-flowered weeds grew in thick clumps from the debris, and a tenacious young pine tree had taken root in a deep fissure on the north side, its green branches a stark flag of life against the decay. The wind, funneling down from the high peaks, made a low, mournful sound as it moved through the gaps in the stonework. It was a place that felt not just abandoned, but forgotten by time itself. Sarah walked the perimeter slowly, her boots crunching on fallen grit. She laid a hand on the surviving wall of the base. The stones were cool and rough beneath her palm. They were local sandstone, shades of tan and rust, expertly fitted. The mortar between them was failing, turning to dust in many places, but the skill of the hands that had laid them a century or more ago was still evident. These were not careless builders. She saw where the heavy oak door had once hung, its frame now just a void. She peered into the darkness of the ground floor chamber. It was filled halfway to the ceiling with more rubble that had fallen from above. There was no roof, only the sharp blue of the sky. Anyone else would have seen only a liability, a dangerous mess that would cost a fortune to clear. But Sarah, trained by her father to see the structure within the material, saw something else. She saw salvageable stone, good dense blocks that could be used again. She saw massive timbers of old growth pine that, beneath the char and weathering, might still be sound. She saw a foundation that had held for 100 years and was still, in its essence, strong. She saw work. But it was work far beyond her own strength. She could not move these stones alone. She needed help. That evening, she walked the mile to the nearest homestead, a small ranch owned by a family named Calloway. Mrs. Calloway, a woman with kind eyes and work-roughened hands, gave her a glass of cool water and listened to her story. "You bought the old ruin?" she asked, her expression a mixture of pity and disbelief. "Child, what for?" "It was what I could afford," Sarah answered simply. "I need help to clear the rubble. I can pay in salvage, stone and timber." Mrs. Calloway shook her head. "No man around here will want that work. Too dangerous for too little reward." Then she paused, her gaze turning toward the western ridge. "There is one, maybe, James Ward. He's a stonemason, the best this valley ever saw. But he don't work much anymore. He keeps to himself." She gave Sarah directions to a small cabin set back in a canyon. "He's a good man," she added quietly. "But he's carrying a heavy weight." Sarah found James Ward the next morning. His cabin was small and impeccably built, with a stone chimney that rose straight and true. A man sat on the porch, sharpening a chisel on a whetstone, his movements slow and deliberate. He was perhaps 40, with dark hair threaded with gray, and a face etched with a sorrow so deep it seemed part of his bones. He looked up as she approached, his eyes wary. This was a man accustomed to being left alone. Sarah did not waste time with pleasantries. She told him her name, what she had bought, and what she proposed. "I need the rubble cleared," she said, her voice even. "I'm offering half of all salvageable stone and timber in exchange for the labor to recover it." James Ward stopped his work. He looked at her, his gaze taking in her worn dress, her determined face, and the calluses already forming on her hands. He had heard about the auction, of course. The whole valley had. He'd heard the laughter. He knew what people thought of the woman who'd bought the ruin. "That's a fool's bargain," he said, his voice rough from disuse. "That pile is unstable. Most of that stone is fractured beyond use. The timber is rotten. Some of it is," Sarah corrected him gently. "Not all. The base is sound. The foundation is good. The builders knew their craft." Her use of the word craft seemed to land with him. He looked at her again, with a flicker of something more than dismissal. He was a man who understood that word. He had lost his wife to a fever 2 years prior, and a year after that, a spring flood of unprecedented force had taken out the new stone bridge he had just completed downriver. No one was hurt, but the failure, his first and only, had shattered his reputation and his spirit. He had retreated into his grief and his shame, his skill a source of private torment. He saw in Sarah a different kind of ruin, a different kind of quiet endurance. He saw the same integrity in her that she had seen in the old mission stones. "I'll come and look at it," he said at last. He came that afternoon. He walked the site for an hour without speaking, running his hands over the stones, testing the timbers with the point of his knife. Finally, he turned to her. "The risk is yours," he said. "But the work is honest. I'll help you." They began the next day. It was slow, dangerous, back-breaking labor. Using a long iron bar as a lever and a system of ropes and wooden rollers, they started on the easiest section, the outward spill of smaller stones. James worked with a grim, focused economy of motion, his knowledge of weight and balance instinctive. He taught Sarah how to read the tension in the pile, to see which stone was a key, holding others in place. For days, they worked in a shared silence. The only sounds the scrape of stone, the groan of wood, and their own steady breathing. They were clearing the north side, near the base of the great, charred beams that had once supported the bell, when James called out. "Hold!" He was pointing to a large oak beam that was wedged precariously over a deep cavity in the rubble. "If we move this, the whole section above it could come down." They spent the rest of the day carefully clearing a path, securing the pile above with chocks and braces. The next morning, using 2 levers, they applied slow, steady pressure to the massive beam. It groaned, shifted, and then, with a deep sigh of stressed wood, it rolled aside, revealing a dark, protected hollow beneath. And there, nestled in the darkness, it lay. The bell. It was immense, easily 5 feet across at its lip, its bronze surface turned a beautiful, mottled green with a century of patina. It was lying on its side, miraculously uncracked, shielded from the falling stone by the very timbers that had once held it aloft. And as they stared in stunned silence, Sarah saw something else. Tucked into the space between the great iron clapper and the side of the bell, wrapped in a sheath of oilcloth and sealed with dark red wax, was a slender metal tube. Her hands trembling slightly, she reached into the dusty hollow and retrieved it. The wax was brittle and cracked as she worked it open. Inside, rolled tightly, was a document. It was a heavy parchment, written in the elegant looping script of a Spanish scribe. At the top was the seal of the King of Spain, dated 1788. It was a land grant, deeding the mesa of San Isidro and the surrounding acres not to a person, but to the mission itself. And at the bottom, in plain, clear language that transcended the centuries, was a clause: "This land is given in perpetuity for the service of God and the community of this valley. It shall not be sold, nor seized for commerce, nor its purpose altered by any secular authority." It was signed by the governor of the territory and countersigned by a priest, Father Miguel de la Cruz. It was the original deed. The land was not the railroad's. It had never been the railroad's. It was hers. The discovery of the bell and the deed transformed their labor from an act of salvage into an act of reclamation. The weight of the bronze was nothing compared to the weight of the truth they had uncovered. For James Ward, the find was a current of purpose in the stagnant water of his grief. His skill was no longer a monument to his failure, but the very tool needed for this quiet fight. The shame that had stooped his shoulders began to lift, replaced by a craftsman's focused resolve. "We have to raise it," he said, his voice imbued with an authority Sarah had not heard before. "We have to rebuild the belfry. And then we ring it." Their work took on a new character. It was no longer about just clearing rubble, it was about building. James, now fully the master mason, directed the project. They sorted the fallen stone, setting aside the whole sound blocks of sandstone. He showed Sarah how to chip away the old crumbling mortar and how to mix a new batch, using lime, sand, and water, teaching her the feel of a proper consistency, sticky and rich. They began to repair the tower's base, replacing shattered stones, filling the gaps, making the foundation solid and true once more. Word of their discovery began to travel through the valley, carried on the afternoon wind from the Callaway Ranch to the general store and beyond. At first, it was just a rumor, another strange tale about the foolish woman and her pile of rocks. But then people started to come. The first was Elias Thorne, the valley's blacksmith. He was an old man with arms like knotted oak and a face blackened by the soot of his forge. He came on his mule one afternoon, dismounted, and stared at the great green bell for a long time. James showed him the deed. Elias read it slowly, his lips moving, then handed it back. "My grandfather was born in this valley," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He told me the railroad lawyers came through 50 years ago with papers from Denver. Said the old Spanish claims were void. Most people sold for pennies an acre. Some just left." He looked from the deed to the bell. "This changes things." He walked over to the rubble and picked up a piece of the original twisted iron hardware. "You'll need new straps to hang it. A new bolt for the clapper. I'll forge them. You pay me for the iron when you can." He left without another word. A few days later, a woman named Maria Flores appeared at the site, carrying a basket covered with a checkered cloth. She was in her 60s, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, her black hair in a single thick braid down her back. Her family had been in the valley since before it was a state. She unpacked a pot of venison stew, a loaf of still warm bread, and 2 tin cups. As they ate, she told them stories her grandmother had told her. Stories of the mission when it was whole, of feast days and the sound of the bell that could be heard all the way to the western ridge. She looked at the name on the deed. "Father Miguel," she whispered. "He baptized my great-grandmother." Her presence was a quiet, powerful endorsement. She began coming every few days with food, her visits weaving their work into the living history of the valley. The final piece of their nascent community arrived in the form of Samuel Bishop, a young rancher whose loud laughter had been among the sharpest at the auction. He rode up one morning, dismounted, and stood twisting the brim of his hat in his hands, his face flushed with embarrassment. I heard what you found," he stammered, not quite meeting Sarah's eyes. "My pa, he always said the railroad deal smelt bad." He gestured toward the tower. "Raising that bell will take more than 2 pairs of hands. I have a team of draft horses, strongest in the valley. They're yours for the day you need them." Sarah simply nodded. "Thank you, Samuel. We will need them." The work continued, stone by stone, day by day. James taught Sarah how to use a stone hammer and chisel, how to face a block so it would sit flush. She learned the patient rhythm of the work, the deep satisfaction of seeing a wall rise straight and strong under her own hands. Together, they built a new timber frame from the best of the salvaged beams, its joinery clean and tight, a testament to the lessons of 2 different fathers, a century apart. The tower was no longer a ruin, it was becoming whole again. The day of the raising dawned clear and cold. A small crowd had gathered at the base of the tower, drawn by a curiosity that had ripened into a sense of communal anticipation. Elias Thorne was there, his newly forged iron straps and bolts laid out on a piece of canvas. Maria Flores stood with a group of other women from the old valley families, their faces solemn and watchful. Samuel Bishop was already in place with his team of 2 massive Belgian horses, their breath pluming in the crisp air, the rigging of ropes and pulleys stretching from their harnesses to the gin pole James and Sarah had erected beside the tower. The great bell sat on a wooden sled, ready. Just as they were about to begin, 2 men on horseback rode up. One was the sheriff from Durango Junction. The other was a man in a city suit, Mr. Hayes, a regional manager for the railroad and Barlow's superior. "This is far enough, Ward," Hayes said, his voice cutting through the quiet. "This is company property. I have a court order here to have you and this woman removed as trespassers." The sheriff, a weary-looking man named Coulter, dismounted, the paper in his hand. But before he could take a step, Sarah moved to stand in front of him. She did not speak. She simply held out the parchment deed. Coulter took it, his eyes scanning the Spanish script and the ancient seal. He looked at the crowd, at the determined faces of Elias Thorne and Maria Flores. He looked at James Ward, standing by the bell, his hand resting on the bronze as if it were an old friend. He looked at the solid new stonework of the tower base. This was not the simple eviction of a vagrant he had been led to expect. This was something else entirely. "Mr. Hayes," the sheriff said slowly, handing the deed back to Sarah. "This document appears to be a legitimate prior claim. I'm not a judge. I can't rule on its validity here and now, but I will not enforce your order until a circuit court has examined it." Hayes's face turned a blotchy red. "Sheriff, this is a clear case of 'it's a civil matter,'" Coulter interrupted, his tone firm. "And I will not be a party to a potential injustice." He turned his horse and tipped his hat to Sarah. "Ma'am." Hayes sputtered, but seeing he had lost, he wheeled his horse around and galloped away in a fury. A quiet cheer went through the small crowd. James met Sarah's eyes and gave a single, sharp nod. It was time. He gave the signal to Samuel Bishop. "Heave." Samuel called to his team, and the horses leaned into their harnesses. The ropes went taut. The massive bell, weighing well over a ton, began to lift from the sled. It rose slowly, swinging gently, a great green pendulum against the sky. The crowd held its breath. Under James's precise directions, the bell was guided into place within the new timber belfry. With hammers and wrenches, he and Elias Thorne swarmed the frame, securing the heavy iron straps, bolting it firmly into its cradle. When it was done, James descended and walked to the new bell rope. He looked not at the crowd, but at Sarah. He gestured for her to take it. She stepped forward, her heart pounding. She took the thick, coarse rope in her hands, and she pulled. For the first time in 100 years, the voice of the San Isidro bell spoke. It was not a clang, but a deep, resonant tone, a B-flat so pure and powerful it seemed to make the very air vibrate. The sound rolled out from the tower, across the mesa, down into the valley, echoing off the far granite cliffs. It was a sound of profound presence, a declaration of existence that could not be ignored. It was the sound of a promise kept. In the months that followed, the ringing of the bell settled into the rhythm of the valley. The tower was no longer a ruin, but a landmark, a center. Sarah, with James' continued help, finished her work. The ground floor chamber of the tower, once choked with debris, was now a single clean room. She had a new plank floor, a small iron stove Elias Thorne had found for her, and a sturdy door with a lock. The walls were thick stone, the ceiling was made of the soundest of the old timbers, and 2 small, deep-set windows let in the morning light. It was not large, but it was solid, warm, and entirely her own. James Ward, his name cleared not by a court, but by the evidence of his craft, found his skills in demand again. He was hired to repair stone foundations and chimneys throughout the valley, his quiet competence a respected currency. He did not move from his cabin, but most evenings he found his way to the tower. Sharing a simple meal with Sarah, their conversation as comfortable and unhurried as the work they had shared. Their partnership had been forged in labor and respect, and it was slowly, quietly, blossoming into something more. The railroad had not given up its claim, but the deed had forced the matter into the slow, grinding gears of the federal courts, where a judge would have to weigh the authority of a Spanish king against that of a railroad baron. The valley, now united behind the story of the bell, was prepared for the fight. They had raised money to hire a lawyer. The bell tower had become a symbol of their own history, their own right to exist. One evening in late autumn, Sarah stood in the doorway of her small home, looking out as the setting sun painted the western ridge in shades of orange and deep purple. The bell above her was a dark, silent silhouette against the vibrant sky. The air was cool and smelled of pine and coming snow. She held the small, smooth cedar bird her father had carved for her so many years ago. Its familiar weight was a comfort in her palm, a link to the man who had taught her to see the worth in things and in herself. She walked to the deep windowsill of her new room and placed the bird upon it. Beside it, she set a small, square-headed nail, its iron rusted and bent, which James had pulled from one of the original belfry timbers and saved for her. The two objects sat side by side, one from the quiet man who had raised her, and one from the quiet man who had helped her raise a new life from the ruins of the old. She thought of the laughter in the auction yard, the feeling of absolute isolation on the road, and the impossible weight of the first stone she had tried to move. She thought of the green bronze of the bell emerging from the dust, and the sound of its voice rolling across the land. She was 27 years old and had come to this valley with nothing but $74 and a memory. She had spent it all on a pile of broken stone that no one wanted. It was the best $74 anyone had ever spent. If this story found a home with you, we hope you'll share it with someone who might need to hear it. And we'd love to know in the comments below, what is something you have seen value in when others saw only a ruin?